that makes, that's good.
Whether it was permanent. Other people do it, but she's talking.
I'm glad. You deserve it, I'm glad. But that's good. That's good,
But as I said,
Stress.
She's got she's going to Japanese.
Yeah, it does.
She wants an MBA, so she gets that's without instruction.
It does go like that. My Betsy's husband was diagnosed about a year ago now with the stage 4 colon and lung cancer. Yeah, and he's just 49 now. And he had extensive, intense chemotherapy. And oh, he was so sick, James. God, he was so sick, so sick. And he finished chemo and radiation. I want to say last fall, maybe September, October. And he kind of no, he got a little bit of energy because the weight and he just went a year ago. And so ready to go to the scans. His back is swelling. I mean, we all know that. You don't escape the stage 4. And so Chloe is his first therapy. And they're going to try that. Because the intense chemo only gave him 4 months remission. So the next round of chemo isn't going to be as effective. And as you said, yeah, they have 2 little ones. She married later. They had one, Ellie, who's 11, and Ned just turned, he was 8. You know, he'll be actually 9 and you know, the only thing you want, just to want to a year or 2 years, get the kids.
It must have been because I've never seen her in person.
You know what I mean? So she's going to have to work. And they're down in Arlington, Virginia. So it does happen. You know what happens? They wrap us all once. You know, you think you've escaped it most of you. Your wife or your marriage or whatever.
no initiatives.
It is. This goes always. Do you know when you're perfectly safe, you live in the suburbs. So it's all the transit group. And they stick when it last, again, it was a year ago this time. They were trying to rally around Betsy and Andrew. And they were doing meals and Betsy said, listen, cease with the meals. We're not eating. And County gets the they don't want all casseroles. Yeah, exactly. We have boy days. And rides. Yeah, you're about 20, well, probably about 20 minutes. It isn't bad. And then the other one, I haven't met him. I really don't know anything about him, but I know that those Andrew and Betsy just he's very original, very friendly, and he's never promised them anything. That we can work with this as much as we can. And he's very they think so. Monday. And again, it was lunch. We had lunch. And some in his phones. Yeah. My son-in-law, Betsy's husband. But we'll get through. She's a good, strong person. She is. She works for the Institute of Library and Museum. And she grants, do all the grants for museums and libraries. And of course, it's one agency that grants is useful. And but she told me last year, and I haven't quizzed her again. Let me ask some you know. And but I think she told me she will work for 20 years.
What do you mean by
Yeah, she'll have her 20 years in, and yeah, that was my. I don't care anymore. I don't care anymore.
Yeah, but that's.
I was trying to clear out my closet. And the answer was so I said, see if I can. So I have to image it. So I had on t-shirt, short sleeves. Just here. And then I said, oh, but just different. I went, it's different. No, I like it. Stick around.
See, I like it. I like it down to the skin. I've worn everything. Go ahead, you can pass it. I know.
Yeah, I ran out and found that.
I know, sorry. We're up and down.
Two great people in a row. I mean, what more could you ask for?
How true. Be careful. Get up.
Now, did you know about the Highlander courses, the Highlander talks in Situate? At the GAR Hall and Brewery? I mean, they charge you for them because they're not.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he's talking at the GAR Hall about Lindbergh. And the brewery, he's talking, at the Situate Brewery, he's talking about the prohibition.
Right down in Stockbridge.
Where the old Fitzmill was. Do you remember Fitzmill?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not at Fitzmill though. It's as you ride.
It's a little bit in, right, but it's at the brewery.
You know, you come out
Brewery. Is that
a brewer. It's new.
Oh, okay. All right.
It's new.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't know it wasn't
But
him that lived there.
if you come,
Oh, I know where Fitzmill is and all that.
yeah, well,
I know that
but
is.
you don't even go that far. You just go in the road,
Oh.
and it's right there on your right.
Ah.
And he's giving two, one at the GAR and that.
Oh, wow.
June 8th and June,
Nuremberg.
you have to call the Situate Historic Society and get either tickets or whatever. Did you get
Wow.
yours?
Yeah, we got
Oh,
ours.
that's good.
Joe didn't get one. I said
Did
to
you
Joe.
get a ticket?
I got a ticket and Janice
Did you get a physical
No,
ticket?
no.
No.
We have to pick them up. I get, or whatever. I don't know.
I think it's like this, you check in.
I think Dr. Price and Denise are going, but they could only get tickets to the brewery. They couldn't get the GAR hall, and the one that Joe wanted to listen to was on Lindbergh. She's great. She's great. Is this the first year she's done this? No, she's done a lot of them.
She's done a lot of them. I don't think in the last couple of years.
What's her
Maybe
name?
Rita Peters, Dr. Rita Peters.
She's great. She engages you the same way as the only
Yes.
the only thing is I don't like her asking the people in the audience in the beginning about questions because then they take up all the time that she's going to talk. I'd rather the questions be asked
Yeah,
at the end.
Write it down on the eval, because they won't know unless.
You want me to write it down?
Yeah, I read on your evaluation. Here.
Oh, you.
This is her last class.
Here it is.
Oh, thank you.
Is everyone to evaluation? No. Because this is the last class.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, write it down.
Oh, I will write it down.
Yeah,
I was just
still
saying.
they always want to.
I won't. The only thing that I have against this.
I didn't want
asking
give me a
questions.
few
Asking
It would.
I didn't like her asking questions throughout the whole thing from people in the audience. I'd rather she wait until after her talk, the last 15 minutes or something. And what the hell is her name? I don't know her name. What's her name?
Rita Peters.
Peter? Oh, no, how could I forget that? Hello?
Absolutely.
Thank you. You were so smart.
Hello, Needham. Hingham. See, that's why I'm not good on this long distance. And some of you are on a trip, right? So the rest of you came for the grand finale. All right, I think it's time. And so I forgot, how much time do you need to do these? So I'll end. Yeah. Yeah.
Don't worry about that.
Want me to just fill them out? Okay, so I'm going to begin not with the conclusion per se, but because you raised, some of you asked about Beslan, right? Am I right? Do you still want to hear more about it? So what I'm going to suggest is that there are three moments in Putin's, political career, if you like. And that was, one was the sinking of the Kursk, which was a submarine with all hands killed. The other was the theater siege, which I talked about, and then Beslan, which I talked less about, I just mentioned it. Those three things tell us something very important about Putin and perhaps about the broader political culture. And that was that in each case, the lives of people involved were not really taken into account. It was other factors that counted. So in the case of the Kursk, I think it was the Swedes and some others offered to help. They have the kind of technology that could be used for deep sea rescue, and they were convinced that they could get the sub up and save the men. Well, Putin not only didn't react, he was on vacation and he kept playing whatever he was playing. He really just, no response. And when the offers came in for the rescue, he didn't take them. He didn't take them, and we don't know why, but it seems that it's most reasonable to think that he simply did not want foreign aid, and he'd rather let them die. And we know, and the families knew, that they remained alive for a long period of time because they kept knocking on the submarines. There was sound coming. So that's one. The theater case was particularly damning because it turned out that what puzzled people were puzzled. Why was it that the suicide terrorists did not pull the cord on their vests, which were supposed to be dynamite vests, and that's what they were holding them hostage with in this theater? Why didn't they pull them when they started to fill, the FSB started to fill the theater with gas that was going to disable them? Well, guess what? There was no dynamite. And so the whole thing appears to have been a kind of theater that was politically motivated. So that was one thing. The other thing was that the gas that was used was not known, was not, the medical, the doctors, et cetera, didn't know what it was. So they couldn't figure out what antidote they needed. And so hundreds of people died. Then Beslan, another case, that clearly was not, there's no indication whatsoever that it was somehow, theater the way the church, the theater hostage taking was. But there was something else. There were people who were going to negotiate with them. They, and Politkovsky was one. They had certain demands that were, I think, entirely doable, but at least they could have been negotiated with. So it appears that in that case, the people in that school in Beslan did not want anyone to die. That's not what they were looking for. They were looking for some kind of a negotiation. And so all the indications are, and that's Masha Gessen, the reference I gave you. She really documents that, including the point that from the theater, one of the terrorists came out alive. So the question was, why did he come alive? So he was really working for the FSB. In any case, in Beslan, again, over 300 people died, mostly children, and nobody needed to die, because the accounts are that the terrorists, well, they took them hostage. They were so determined not to have children killed that they were ushering them, shepherding them into areas of the school they thought would be safe. And instead, the tanks lobbed shells at they put them in the gymnasium, and that's where they shelled. So that kind of disregard, I would not even disregard, prioritization of various political agendas over the very immediate threat to life. That's a major issue. I mean, the United States didn't do great in Waco, right? That was, but that at least was a long standoff, and evidently the Attorney General believed there was child molestation. And I think to this day, we don't actually know whether there was or wasn't. But, well, anyhow, be that as it may, these are really egregious cases of that kind of, and the Kursk, maybe more than any, was a case where really nobody needed to die, because they knew how to bring it up. So do you have any questions on these cases? Because I know I didn't go into more detail when we talked about them earlier. Well, then I shall launch into my masterpiece conclusion. There are any number of things that we could address by way of conclusion. So I prefer to pursue the theme of the title of our seminar, Russian-American relations from Stalin-Truman to Putin-Trump. And I think one useful way of doing it is to compare. What was similar, or maybe the same, between those two eras, the Soviet and the Russian, and Cold War and post-Cold War? What was similar and what was different? And so that's what I propose to do as a way of summing up what we've been doing for 5 weeks, imagine. By the way, I have already the fall course all mapped out, which is going to be 6 weeks too. Just a footnote. Yeah, they gave me the same. They really spoiled me, but I put down at the same time. It's international relations. What did I call it? In the 21st century, and problems facing international politics. So it's going to be not one theme, U.S.-Russia throughout, but rather various kinds of challenges, the major challenges in international relations, and how we're screwing it all up. You always have to have that. Huh?
A lot could change by then.
It could. Let's see. Well, the basic sort of premise of what the U.S.-Russia or U.S.-Soviet relationship is, I think remains constant. There's competition. There are challenges, mutual challenges. And it can be well interpreted in terms of the general proposition about great power engagements, that they're bound to be competitive and so on. So that's kind of a basic premise. Now, the first thing to look at is the reach of the relationship. What is the arena in which the relationship functions? Well, to begin with, there are differences on that between the Truman era and the Trump, what do we call it? The Trump, we don't call it an era, do we? One thing, I guess I'm not hiding my well, the difference between Russia, the Soviet Union and the United States in that post-war period was that the United States really had a global agenda. They had global interests. The United States defined their interests, their national interests, in terms of every region. We had interests that we pursued in Asia, in the Middle East, and of course Latin America, and of course Europe. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, had also global interests, but of a different type. Their idea was to promote communist revolution, and everywhere. They gave up on Europe, I would say, although they had powerful communist parties in Europe, and the two most powerful were the Italian communists and the French communists. And they're rather interesting that the Italians, as you would expect, more laid back, they went to what came to be called Euro-communism, with Togliatti ending up saying communists should try to win through the ballot, not revolution. That was a major revision of what Moscow had been preaching. But the French communists, they were more Stalinist than Stalin. They remained Stalinist long after Stalin was gone. So they were very hard communists. But in any case, what is interesting for both the US and the Soviet Union at the time was that they pursued policies inconsistently. So the Soviet Union promoting revolution everywhere, and supporting communists. But when it came to the communist agenda being in conflict with state-to-state relations, the Soviets ditched the communists. So when Khrushchev courted Nasser, there was a state visit to Egypt, and they gave them loans, and they were going to do the Aswan Dam, and it was going to be this really flourishing relationship. And this is while Nasser was jailing all the communists, right? And Mohammed Hakel, and this he said in his book, and I also talked to him about it, Mohammed Hakel was the closest to Nasser. And he said that Khrushchev never raised the issue of the communists with Nasser. So it's not like sometimes you think, okay, they did it behind the scenes. No, not at all. Go ahead, jail them. So they ditched the communists because for them, the relationship with Egypt that they saw as a kind of entree to the Middle East altogether, that was more important than the communists. Similarly, with Latin America, when they decided, the Kremlin decided that they wanted to have good relationships with Latin American states, they suddenly forgot to promote revolution. And all the communist parties in Latin America, and they were everywhere really, but not very influential, they were just left to their own devices, to make their own tortillas. Well, what the United States did at the same time was sort of a mirror image of the Kremlin. They were also promoting something, but they were promoting democracy, democratization. Who could object to that? However, while promoting democracy, it turns out that the promotion mostly focused on Eastern Europe, which was Soviet realm. And when it came to the states that we had close relationships with, Spain and Portugal, dictatorships, we had good relations with them and didn't say a word about democratization. So both these powers had that instrumental take on their primary ideology, their primary international message. I also should mention that the United States did something more often than the Soviets did, and that is punish regimes that seem to show support or allegiance to the Soviet Union at that time. And so Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, who led Ghana to independence, 1957, by 1960, he decided, or 59, he decided he wanted to have a good relationship with Moscow as well as Washington, because he saw himself as this major trailblazing leader on the world stage. And Moscow gave him the Medal of Lenin, or Friendship Medal, whatever. They're kind of ugly medals, so anyhow, and so Moscow got him, and we shoved him away. We took very negative positions on him. And then, of course, Nasser. Nasser was punished for establishing a good relationship with the Soviet Union. And at this was a time when the non-aligned movement, which comprised Asian, African, Middle Eastern states, and also Yugoslavia, and they claimed that they would not align with either bloc. Well, the Soviets were okay with that because that was in their favor. But Washington and Dulles famously said in this conflict between, the godless communists and us, there can be no neutrals. And so we were very critical of the non-aligned movement, which was okay because he gave me fodder for my dissertation. So that worked out fine for me. Well, when we move from the Soviet Union to now Putin, then we find that today the focus of American policy is not really Russia or, well, obviously not the Soviet Union, but instead the main focus of our concerns, security concerns and so on, is radical Islam. And we pay much less attention to Russia, to their great displeasure. Now, we still pay attention to Russia, but it's just that from Second World War till the end of the Cold War, Russia was the main focus. And now that's been diluted. So that's one major difference. The second point to make here is that while the Soviet Union was actually global in the support of communist parties and so on and so forth, Russia, in terms of its ability to exert influence, not ambition. Ambition is global, but ability is regional, as Obama famously made that point. One thing about Obama, there were times when he really knew how to stick it to Putin. Trump clearly doesn't know how to do that. Well, he doesn't want to. Because Putin has his points where you could probe. The regional aspect was writ large when they moved on Ukraine and annexed Crimea, and obviously the West was able to do nothing about it. But it's important to point out that Russia does have an ambition for global reach, and that is most starkly shown by the involvement in Syria. Today, you could not do anything in Syria without noting what Russia wants or needs. You cannot ignore Russia's interests in Syria. That's a major accomplishment by Putin. And it's an accomplishment that was done really because of the West, and particularly the United States, not paying attention. And that's what, just so you realize that I'm kind of even-handed, I do consider that Obama made a mistake by first of all, saying that red line thing, and then not doing anything about it. And that is what made it clear to Putin that there was an opportunity for him. And for him, it was important. He was opposed to regime change, and particularly regime change as engineered by Washington. So for him, the stakes were very high. And I think in Washington, there was a lack of understanding of how high the stakes actually were until it was too late. So in any case, we couldn't say that Russia is a global power today, but it certainly has the ambitions, and it certainly is out further than it was before. Russia really was, well, had no place in the Middle East, for example. And so this is kind of a return. Now, pardon?
Booted out of Afghanistan in a rout?
So the question is, didn't the Soviets get booted out of Afghanistan? They left. So it wasn't that they booted. The Mujahideen were not able to win, but they fought them to a stalemate, in part because we'd given them Stinger missiles. And so this meant that the Soviets did not have air control, so they couldn't fly their helicopters, which was the main weapon they had. And so Gorbachev wanted to end it, and he did. So, yeah. But it was one of those stalemated conflicts. But they also, I think, understood where the thing, Gorbachev did, that not only it was unwinnable, but perhaps pointless. Putin doesn't see it that way. Not that he would want to go back in, but I think he values Afghanistan more highly. But you know that was one of the things that Putin claimed he helped us, because we got bases in areas that Kremlin controlled. And also, when Putin, he's fond of criticizing us on all kinds of things, but he doesn't, I don't recall him saying much about Afghanistan, so whatever that means. Well, so the second area of comparison would be aims. What were the aims? What were the goals of the West and of the Soviet Union and then Russia? Well, Russia, since Putin came to power, is focused on resurgence. He's focused on making Russia great again. But he succeeded. He has succeeded to a large extent. Now, what he wants, it's more specific than that. He wants, above all, a parity or equality with the United States. And so if you read his speeches, he hardly ever says anything about international relations without criticizing American unilateralism and arguing that the world is multilateral, or multipolar, and therefore the United States must take them into account. It's a constant theme: equality, equality, equality. And if you have to insist, it means you don't have it, right? So that's a kind of grievance that Putin has had from maybe before he even came to power. Now, two things about this equality. In the case of Stalin, Stalin did not have to say, we want to be treated as equals, because they were. But for a sort of particular reason. I mean, they were not economically, politically, in any way the equals of the West. One was, and that was?
Nuclear?
Indeed, they had nukes. And that evened the whole playing field, right? So Stalin did not have to fight that battle. It was simply taken as understood. Putin, on the other hand, constantly battles the problem of being excluded. He wants to be included. And when I say constantly, he's even losing ground. So Russia was taken out of the G8. That was G7 that Clinton kind of a gift to Yeltsin. And so it became G8. And that is the most important industrial powers that are democracies. And so Russia was never a proper fit. So it was really Clinton's gift for other things, like, you know, behaving well on other things. So Putin, when they were taken out or disinvited from G8, he said something like, well, who cares? I mean, they're nothing. But he cared deeply. That's...
When did that happen? What prompted?
That was, I think, before even Crimea, but for sure Crimea. I'm trying to think, because that sort of thing has to happen when there's going to be a meeting. So they were simply not invited. I don't think there was ever a formal thing, you're out. You know, it's not that sort of thing. So it was kind of, and Putin gloried in having Russia serve as host for one of the G8 meetings. There's no question that it was very important to him. And to be excluded was a kind of delegitimizing move. So,
When was that? Under whom?
Putin. Oh, Bush. Yeah, Bush. Bush, you know, initially, like when he met Putin, he was sort of favorably inclined. You know, he famously said that he looked into Putin's eyes. And he saw his soul. He didn't say what color the soul was. But anyway, so he tried to have a good relationship, but that didn't work. You know, as I'm listening to myself talk, I think it was really Obama's. I'm sorry, I take that back. It wasn't Bush. It was Obama, and I'm so horribly awful with dates. I can't. Somebody could Google it and find out. When did they get kicked out? See, you've got to get better on this. You know, in class, if I say something, I say, I don't know the date. In 2 seconds, a student will have it. I don't know how they do it. But I think I got spoiled being in class with them because I figured I don't have to know anything. They can Google it up. It was Obama. Huh?
You gotta remember it.
Thrown out of G8.
It was Obama. But Obama, I mean, he also wanted to have a good relationship with Moscow, but Moscow pretty much made it impossible. So.
Says it was the end of March 2014.
Crimea. So what, yeah. See, I should have gone with my first. I know that Bush considered sort of some action on Moscow, but yeah, so it was.
So the other thing they say here, which is interesting, is the header on this is from G8 to G7, revisiting the Russia G7 divorce, how Moscow came out on top. And it said they actually freed them up to rapidly accelerate its geoeconomic diversification and lay the foundation for entirely new economic fundamentals.
Okay, wait a minute. Who's the source? That sounds like Moscow. That's
Global research.
What is it?
Global research, and I think it's out of Canada.
Moscow. That's Moscow.
Are you?
I'm not. Yeah, I mean that is their position on it, but nothing supports that. Because their economy, if anything, it kept sort of going down as long as the oil prices, energy prices were down. I kind of have a nose for Moscow's line. No, it definitely did not do them any, there was nothing positive from Moscow's point of view, but it was humiliating. Because it basically said that, you know, you are an aggressor, you're not a democracy, you don't belong here. And that's how they took it. That kind of thing, it has a lot of sort of symbolic meaning, but it's really very serious. And are you finding other stuff? No. Oh. Huh?
Yeah, I'm not either. I'm not
On Wi-Fi.
You know, that's probably Russian bots that gave us.
Russia came out on top, right?
There you go.
I like Holland. Oh, it was here. Oh, I know.
Who's the author, by the way?
Russian.
In
Korybko.
Oh, yeah,
You know?
yeah. Well, I saw the name, but see, told you. See, what Russians would have liked that that's what it would mean, but it definitely didn't. Well, in any case, the Putin struggle over, you know, as opposed to Soviets, it's exactly, well, the opposite almost, you would say. In Stalin's time, Moscow could be secure of their sphere of influence, or as secure as you can get. You know, there were sort of incidents of espionage, and you know, we were talking about democracy, and during Eisenhower's campaign and presidency, Dulles was talking about rolling back communism, which meant in Eastern Europe. So there was that. But otherwise, no one really questioned Moscow's sphere of influence. It was there. It was understood to be effective. It was understood that Moscow dominated Eastern Europe. There was no question of anything else. And it first became obvious when the West, the United States, offered the Marshall Plan, and some East Europeans wanted to join, notably Poland and Czechoslovakia, and Moscow said no. And their words stuck. These countries could not do that. That was the clear-cut signal of these spheres of influence. Now, Putin, on the other hand, talks about spheres of influence, or as he likes to say, areas of special interest. Well, because spheres of influence sounds kind of imperialistic. So he wants, but that's what it is. He's talking about spheres of influence. And again, his insisting on it shows you that he feels very insecure about it. Moscow has a great deal of influence, but it does not dominate the space of the former Soviet Union, and certainly not Eastern Europe. Again, they have a great deal of influence. They have bought up banks and various kinds of resources surreptitiously, and there's also corruption. And corruption is something that Moscow uses against other politicians. So there is a strong influence and certainly potential for Moscow's influence in this sphere. But they don't have domination. They don't dominate the region. And equally importantly, they cannot keep the West out, which is what they want. In Stalin's time, or I should say the Soviet era, the West was kept out. Whatever they got was clandestine, but they couldn't get anything openly. Well, now the EU was negotiating even with Ukraine. NATO is it's off the table, but the EU is not. And one reason for that is that the EU has various rubrics to have. It's not just membership. Membership is one thing, but they have other things such as association or special arrangements and so on. And Moscow is not really able to cope with that. So that sphere of influence is definitely being challenged, and that's very different from the Soviet era. Now, while he's afraid, what Putin was very concerned about expansion, he must be satisfied with the fact that EU and certainly NATO expansion really has stalled. Although there's this conversation about Kosovo. I don't know where that's going to go. But in any case, EU is not in a position to do any kind of accession. And that's because of the Euro crisis, then the refugee crisis, then Brexit, and the frozen conflicts. You know, the frozen conflicts where in Ukraine, in Georgia, Moldova, where there is conflict and nobody's even making an effort to resolve the conflicts. And with conflicts of that nature, you cannot possibly consider even accession to NATO or EU. So those are things that favor Putin's approach to the region. So to sum up that part of it, I think it's fair to say that in Truman's time, it was the West that was in the winning position, politically and otherwise. And it was the Soviets that were more likely to be on the defensive. Today, in Trump's time, the situation, I would say, is reversed in the sense that Trump himself has undermined aspects of American power that are actually most challenging to Putin, and that is the alliances, which make America far more influential than it otherwise could be, and also the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whatever the title was. That was an enormously important political device to form a kind of protection against China, actually. And so those things are a serious undermining of the American position. And I'm not going to, the last thing I'm going to do is, and then we'll have the discussion, I want to talk about the means. So we now have, we've considered what they're doing, what their goals are, and then what are their means? What do they have to use in pursuit of their policies? Well, communication is right at the top of our list to consider similarities and differences. In Stalin's time, how did you communicate propaganda or whatever? Well, you had newspapers. My students don't even know what the heck a newspaper is. I think. Newspapers, radio, my favorite. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, indeed. Those are very powerful instruments of Western penetration of the Soviet realm. And besides publications, you also had another interesting device, and that was front organizations. In other words, organizations that presented themselves as, well, this anti-nuclear, whatever they called themselves, was really a Soviet creation. So we called it a front organization. The United States did that also. I think the magazine Encounter was a CIA-sponsored or funded periodical. And there was something Encounter that was, and the CIA also did some things that they got caught at and then forced war. And that was getting academics to do, well, spying and writing things. And I called them up and I asked, could I have a job? And they didn't. I was merely a woman. I mean, if any of you are taking notes, don't write that down. Anyway, so the point about this form of communication was that it was relatively limited and slow. So you see where I'm going. Today, we have instant communication, and it is very broadly disseminated. So cyber warfare is a favorite instrument of particularly Russia. Russia seems to be more active. I mean, there are others, China, North Korea, they're all engaged in this, and evidently we too, but I haven't seen, we seem to be back-footed on these things. But in any case, the Russians, they've become well known for their bot factories. So you have the ability to instantly disseminate hundreds of thousands of communications. That was not available before. Misinformation or fake news, that can be disseminated exactly the same way. So we have a great deal of that. And the significance of that is, as intended, that people are put in a position of not knowing what is true and what is false. And there is a sort of an effect of delegitimizing the media, delegitimizing the political process. In other words, this all adds up to an undermining of democracy, which happens to be Putin's particular goal. And if you sort of wonder, well, why would he do that? Well, mainly because Putin and the Putin regime has been criticized for not being democratic, for not allowing free media, all those things, or not having free and fair elections. And that particularly is a thorn in his side, that he's criticized for that. So, and he says it openly. He said, well, what about you? Right? And so, and that's kind of a typically Russian sort of thing. Yeah, well, what about you? And so undermining our system, and not just ours, but Western Europe, is part of that. And that's where the rationale is, because otherwise it would be hard to explain why would he have an interest in that. But that is why. Putin and Russians in general, if you have a chance to talk with them, if some of you have gone to Russia and so on, they are extremely sensitive to criticism. More sensitive, I think, than Americans ever are. And, you know, I can tell you one anecdote that to me really is iconic of that kind of thing. And I know I've talked about this in my other, well, you're always there, so. But when my husband and I went to, well, we went to Moscow and Leningrad, and there was a restaurant in Moscow. This is 1977, so tourists couldn't just go just anywhere. But there was a restaurant that I knew of from the stuff I'd been reading, and I wanted to go. It was called the Metropole. And I asked the concierge at the hotel, could she please make reservations? And she said no. And this went on, you know, I asked several days and nothing. And finally I said, well, I don't understand. When I traveled to Egypt, the concierge always would get whatever I asked. How is it that you're not capable of doing it? And guess what? That worked. Because she took that as such a knock on her and her system, and she got me the reservations. So,
Was it worth it?
oh, totally. We had 2 bottles of Georgian wine, and that's when we stormed the Winter Palace. I don't know what it's like now, but it was fabulous. Well, we were there for hours. You know, I don't want you to think I knocked off a bottle in whatever. We were there the whole evening. But we also realized why they didn't want tourists to go to the restaurant. At the table next to us, there was a group, and they were dancing, but one of them, in uniform, had his face in his soup plate. I mean, he was passed out. And, so, you know, they don't, in tourist restaurants, you would never, ever. And plus, they didn't, Soviets were not allowed to go to the in-tourist restaurants. But it also highlights that sensitivity on the Russian part of being embarrassed and being sensitive about being somehow inferior. It's a very interesting phenomenon of, on the one hand, having these ideas that they're really superior. They're superior to the West, they're superior to the US, and then inferior. It's there. The two are there all the time. Maybe Russians are just very conflicted. In any case, did any of you, when you went there, did you find that there was that kind of conflicted?
I went with a cousin. It was a group trip for physical therapists. That's what she was. And we went to Moscow and Leningrad, and we were told at that time, do not drink anything that is not bottled and sealed. Don't drink any water. And we would be in a restaurant in the hotel, and we would ask, we'd be there for an hour. The service was super slow. The people did not want to be there serving you.
Right.
And we would get one bottle for 8 people at the table, and you would be thirsting half to death. It was like a push-pull, you know, head-butting kind of thing. The people on the streets who sold the little bundukis, those were fine, but we couldn't drink the water. We were not supposed to drink the water, so most of us
Well, in
actually
some
did that.
cities, it was very contaminated.
Moscow?
Yeah, in some areas of Moscow, evidently. But I know that when first time I went to Riga, I was told absolutely not to drink because it was you're just about bound to get hepatitis.
Oh,
It was pretty bad.
that's why we were looking for Coca-Colas. You know, that was futile. Oh, well, here's our Russian soda. I think I had some of those. They were the flavor was not as strong as American, but it was nice enough.
Yeah.
That's what I remember.
Yeah, they made
Oh,
a
and
deal
tripe
with.
soup. They served a little cup of soup one time, and I'm looking at it and I'm eating it. And everybody is eating it. They're enjoying it. And I said, "Oh, this looks like tripe." 4 spoons went down and didn't get picked up again.
Hey, tripe, that's a good soup.
It is a good soup. It was tasty.
See, one thing in Europe, it's not just Russia, but Europe, at least when I knew Europe, every single part of any animal would be used, you know, which Americans never got into. Well, that's kind of a pessimistic note. Maybe I should warn you now, in case any of you want to leave early. I'm going to end on a pessimistic note because I don't see an alternative. But is there I hear ringing. Yeah. Well, okay. Maybe it's somebody's alarm clock. They dozed off while I was doing this. Well, so just to sum up that, the sensitivity on Moscow's part about the lack of democracy, or so they call it their style of democracy. You know, so yes, we have democracy. It's different. But what is not different, they can't have their own standard, is the lack of fair and free elections. And so undermining Western political processes is the response to the criticism. Now, before I sum up, I want to point out one factor that is radically different from what went on before in the Soviet era. That factor is the emergence of China. The emergence of China pursuing its own agenda, and one that is not really serving either Russian interests or ours, that's that new factor. That is not something the Soviet Union had to cope with. China was a challenge to them in certain ways, like in the Third World was a major challenge. But otherwise, in terms of sort of a global role, I would say no. And that's radically changed. Today, China is a challenge to us, but also to Russia. And Russia tries to downplay that. And Putin has made attempts to have stronger relations with China. But no matter how they cut or slice it, they're the junior partner in that. And that's clear from the Chinese point of view, they're junior. And I think Moscow understands that as well. So let me sum up. In the first place, the US-Russia relationship today is far less dangerous than it had been in the Soviet era, but less dangerous in one sense, and that is the military sense, right? we're no longer concerned about a nuclear exchange, which was something that was always there throughout the Cold War. Until really Gorbachev, there was always concern about that. But the second point is that the US-Russia relationship is far more dangerous than ever before in terms of other factors, including the protection of our democracy, the protection of our political system. Our political system is challenged as really never before. Now, I want to underscore that most of that has to do with shooting ourselves in the foot. But in the process, we present opportunities for Moscow. And Moscow recognizes an opportunity when they see it. And the third and final point is that we are unevenly matched. And that's an argument. I may be altogether wrong. Nah. We are unmatched, or not unmatched, unequally matched in the sense that America's strongest ability is military. There is no power, not even groups of powers, that can equal us in terms of our military capability. Am I right? I think it's true. We have it. We have that. But what we seem not to be able to effectively address, and Russia has, and that's cyber warfare, cyber penetration, hacking, fake news, all of that we are not prepared for. So we're great on the military, but Russia is not challenging us in the military. They're challenging us in an entirely different way for which we are not prepared. So that, I think, is unfortunately the case of the relationship today. I should also maybe point out that part of that shooting ourselves in the foot has to do with maybe if we had to take out a single factor, and that is a kind of unilateralism that this administration is following. So on all the issues having to do with Russia, including cyber attacks, China, Iran, Syria, what am I missing? Climate change. All these things are challenges which cannot be addressed unilaterally. They simply cannot by the nature of the beast. And so this administration is really doing everything it can to undermine any other kind of effort. So is this depressingly enough? So I think is this the only time I ended my seminar with such a downer? Usually I try to salvage something. So if you can salvage, if you have some good upbeat notion. Oh, is it?
I don't know, maybe it's upbeat. This is from this article from The Atlantic, what Putin really wants. And they start off by saying, is he a chess player? And they say, no, he's not a chess player. Oh, he's
Checkers.
A checkers player. And they said, no, he's not that. He's a gambler.
Oh, I don't know.
And then he's just like out on a limb, like with Syria and with hacking of the U.S. And that he's just like taking these chances that are wildly dangerous, really. But things are working out for him.
You know, I haven't seen that article, but I don't agree with that. I don't think he's such a gambler. I mean, you know, the Crimea, he prepared that. And he wasn't such a gambler because he could see, so what are the Europeans going to do? What is the United States going to do?
Well, it says that
So-
because of the two revolutions, what, in 17 and 91 or whatever, that he knows that it's going to happen again soon. And so he can take he's got to take these risks now because there's another revolution coming and he'll be gone. Apparently he fears for himself.
Oh, that he does.
Yeah.
He thinks we want regime change, and he said that.
And Gaddafi, he keeps thinking that's in his brain.
Yeah, no, that I totally agree. There's loads of evidence for that. For the others, I don't know. What issue is that? Is that
It is January, February 2018.
Oh, beyond. I thought I could run over and get it. So anyone else have optimistic?
Yeah, we could put our hopes on the election, the off-year election.
Which election?
Right.
Which election?
Well, okay.
What election?
Did you have your hand up a moment ago? No? Okay. Anyone else?
Another question. What after Putin? What happened?
We don't know because he's
For
not
him, can you
allowing
repeat
anyone
that?
to come up.
And he's not grooming any, but no.
Absolutely not.
Could you
Absolutely
repeat that for
not.
Hingham?
Yeah, I mean, he's jailed. Navalny is the one that is the most obvious challenge, but he doesn't have.
He just went back to jail.
Indeed, and he's already was ruled out because he was convicted, and the Constitution said you can't run. But the thing about Navalny, he's not popular, you know. So even if he wasn't jailed,
Not even with kids.
oh yeah, but in terms of like the electorate as a whole, he doesn't have it. Putin continues to be popular. Well, for Russians, the idea that he can undermine democracy, or from their point of view, showing how flawed it is, that plays well with them. And the idea that he has, you know, that Russia has come back and that it was Putin's doing, that's a very popular notion. Taking of the Crimea, very popular. So all the things that the West deplores, right, yeah.
What is the average
Well, young people do. Young people mainly.
Repeat the question.
Oh, do you want to say it louder?
Hingham too.
I was just saying, what is the average Russian youngster especially? And are they walking around with phones like we are in this country?
Okay, so for Hingham, the question is whether in Russia, young people as here, are they just tied to their phones? And not quite, but you also in Russia have a much larger percentage of the population that depends on TV. And that is controlled by Moscow. So the younger people, yes, they'll support Navalny, but in terms of the and it's not just younger, it's generational, but it's also geographic. So Moscow is a very different place from Russia, which is really, there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of joblessness, there's a lot of what is wrong with Russia, but they continue to support Putin. And I want to remind you that those TV networks, the ORT that belonged to one of the oligarchs and the other RT, I think was Gusinski. So there were three main channels that cover all of Russia. So that has to be taken into account. And when Navalny, this last demonstration spate, the TV never even touched it. So nobody would have known. If you weren't in Moscow, you didn't know that there were demonstrations. That's how bad it is.
So they don't have cell phones then?
Well, young people, not as much, but young people do more,
Is there any kind of restriction on the internet?
Well, they're trying to get restriction, but so far it hasn't worked.
Because there are restrictions in China, aren't there?
Yes. Yeah. China is much more effective in doing that than Russia.
This is another question. Why do you think the West is so weak in cyber warfare?
What's the question?
Why are we so weak in cyber whatever?
Oh, yeah.
How about this? I do not know. I don't know. I don't know what the
technology.
Maybe we're not. Maybe this
Possibly.
hacking of U.S. system is something that the U.S. would not have thought of doing to another country.
We have done it.
We have.
I mean, well, not the same kind of things, but we've interfered with elections. That we have done. I mean, we began, I think the first one. No, we haven't, because as far as I know, but we wouldn't know if we have. So there's that. But we know that the Russians have. So that's, not disputable. Okay, so I think should I be giving you?
There's questions.
Oh, yes.
From Hingham? Talk loudly. Go ahead.
What?
Go ahead.
I can't hear you.
We can't hear you.
My question is, I believe you mentioned.
Is there a mic there that you could get?
Yes, yes. Just a minute.
Oh, there you go.
I'm getting there. Here, this is as far as I can go.
Is that the mic?
Yep. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, just talking to it.
I believe you mentioned that you're doing research currently, and I was wondering whether any of it is helping the Mueller committee.
All I caught was that you said Mueller. But there's something, is your mic on?
Yes, the mic's on.
See if I
Yeah, do you want to hold it up? The mic?
Okay. Again, I'm starting again. I believe you mentioned that you were currently doing research, and I was wondering whether any of it is helping the Mueller committee, or whatever they call it.
I see. Yeah, I wish. I wish. Whether, that I'm doing research and whether that's helping.
Go ahead.
I have a different person. I have a different question.
Could you
Can you hear me?
hold up the mic closer?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Has it been documented whether Russia's fake news had anything to do with influencing England pulling out of the Brexit thing?
Excellent question. Oh, whether the Russian effort had anything to do with Brexit. And I don't know how much conclusive proof we have, but there's a great deal. And it has to do with financing the pro-Brexit people, well, the far right who were for the Brexit. And then there is a lot of sort of circumstantial evidence that indeed there was an effort, that there was misinformation and that sort of thing that influenced. The problem with the Brits, same as ours, we know what was done, but we don't yet know what effect that had. Do you see what I mean? Right? You know, we know they hacked, they did this, they did that. But then, okay, what did it do? That's much harder to determine. But our services are convinced, the CIA, the FBI, everybody is totally clear on interference existing, but they're not there to judge what effect it had. And I'm not sure how you could, at this point, research that. At the time, you might have been able to do it, you know, by very intensive polling, sort of in-depth interviews with people and so on. I don't know if it can be done now, that people might have been influenced by what was said about it all. You know, someone who might have been strongly influenced by misinformation might not want to admit that they were, because it's kind of humiliating. So we may never know what the effect was. But if you consider how close the election was, that I think the final count was nearly 3 million of the popular vote was topped Hillary's vote. Then anything, you know, certainly Comey's plays with the search, the emails, it had to, you know, intuitively, it had to have an effect, but we don't know. So again, we know Comey said what he said, but we don't know how many people might have been influenced. So far, we're still lacking an optimistic whatever.
Okay, I have a question.
Oh, great.
This goes to your question, though. This is how it starts.
We can't hear anything.
Here.
Can you speak? No, wait a minute. Do you have a mic there?
Oh, yeah.
So do you want to do it?
Why don't you read it? It just talks about these hackathons. It's like the first.
Oh, the bots?
No, it's just like.
Okay, where am I reading?
Just the top the beginning paragraph at the very.
Okay, so this is from.
Like in a sunny room.
It's from the Atlantic. Okay, so the large sunny room at Volgograd State University smelled like its contents. Oh God, 45 college students. College students are smelly?
Yeah, yeah.
All but one of the male, hunched over keyboards, whispering and quietly clacking away among empty cans of juicy energy drink. Quote, "It looks like they're just picking at their screens, but the battle is intense," unquote. Victor Minin said as we sat watching them.
Keep going. It's just like
more.
It talks about, yeah.
Okay. Clustered in 7 teams from universities across Russia, they were almost halfway into an 8-hour hacking competition, trying to solve forensic problems that range from identifying a computer virus origins to finding secret messages embedded in images. Minin was there to oversee the competition called Capture the Flag, which had been put on by his organization, the Association of Chief Information Security Officers, in Russian. That's FSB, actually. That they run Capture the Flag competition at schools all over Russia, as well as massive multi-day hackathons in which one team defends its server as another team attacks it. In April, hundreds of young hackers participate in one of them. We don't do that as far as I know.
And that guy said he's been at it since '81. Minin. Wow. Like, he's been.
You're not going to have me read more.
No, no.
People are going to walk out on me.
It's so startling. I mean, as you say, like, how did they get this way? You know, like, oh.
Yeah, it's amazing. They had the foresight that evidently we.
No, I just had a question. You said that the U.S. has interfered in other countries?
Yeah. Well, we began right after World War II. The first election in Italy, the CIA banked, funded the parties
Call it Russia.
that were not communists. That's what they bankrolled several of them to make sure communists would be defeated. Because in Italy, the communists were bound to win. They're going to win, and they lost. Well, they didn't lose. They weren't part of the coalition. And then we did something, well, similar in various other countries, but that was the most dramatic. And that was one that we actually admitted. The CIA became kind of proud of it and would admit it.
It was mostly done when we were, the communist threat, so to speak, during
Indeed. That election was 40-something.
I see.
Morsi in Iran,
Yeah, but that was actually an overthrow.
but backed by the CIA.
Absolutely. Our guy, Kermit Roosevelt, I think was his name, was the one who proudly described it in his memoirs. It's very interesting. He claimed to have done it, but the British intelligence claimed they did. It's wonderful how people want to claim dirty business. But yeah, so we've done that. So in different ways. It wasn't cyber, but and Moscow has a long history of intervening as well. But it seems that in the early years, we were by far more successful.
Another question from Hingham, please.
Something to do with the socialist.
I don't think it's working. It's working because it's green. She can hear you.
Yeah,
Ask the question.
but
Question.
also, I think also Chile.
What's the question?
Chile.
They don't know what the question
What's
was.
the question?
Oh, the question was whether we had something to do with, actually you meant Chile, and we did. But not in the election, because he won. Allende won the election. It was afterward that when the military asked us what would we think of them overthrowing, we didn't say don't do it, which is all they need.
Morsi had won his election too. He was out.
Yeah, but I don't know, Morsi? That was, well, now I can't think of his name, though, because I'm thinking, that wasn't his name. You mean the socialist? Yes. Yeah, who kicked out the Brits. Yeah, he was interesting. He spent his days in bed, so he became the prime minister, but he stayed in bed. Well, group, I have to leave time for you to do the evaluations. So let me tell you, it's been very nice. I thoroughly enjoyed this.
We have another question from Hingham.
Bye, Hingham.
Hingham has a question. Hingham has a
Anybody have an
question.
extra pen? I traveled light today. You're all finished? Oh, thank you.
Well, yeah, usually you should be able to speak right into this from anywhere in the room. What's going on, particularly in the green light, is that an either?
Sure. What's the author of that? Article. Bye. War room up here.
Can you hear us from Hingham for a question?
We had voting in Brookline this week.
Oh, yes.
So I would put everything down.
That was Monday, right?
Yeah.
I know,
Yeah.
I know.
This is
And
Tuesday.
Everything
In
was down.
reality, it isn't, and they can see that.
I'll give it to you. But I'll just, maybe I'll
You
look at
always, you don't have to tell me.
Okay, group.
Yeah.
I have to do a mea culpa. I
What?
was just, tell.
So we actually do those hackathons here in the United States. They start in high school.
Wait, oh, you do? Oh.
Yeah, in high school. They're run by the Air Force.
Oh.
Yeah.
You're kidding.
Yeah, I've done them before.
Really? So what are you doing?
The hackathons.
Oh, really?
We do them here too. Air Force.
Ah.
Wait, the Air Force comes into schools and
They do like,
More dollars
they give
for the high
information to
school.
teachers and the teachers run it, but it's
We're the only two that probably didn't.
you get like free shirts and stuff.
Wow. Then does the CIA recruit you afterwards? Not that we know of.
I know where the high school is. Okay, yeah. I have a friend who lives, well, the next street out from her house kind of backs onto the.
Now it's a whole new world, something new every day.
Yeah, but that's something I should.
No.
These are the kids. She had been married and her husband divorced.
I did too. Yeah, they do come in like that. Yeah.
It's ginormous. You can't take care of it. It's ginormous and it's Victorian and it's.
The average scale.
There's so much in it.
Start it again.
Yeah.
That's all you have to do is read the.
Thank you.
Because they have land around them too, and they usually have a driveway. I live in South Boston and.
Oh, no, is that what she want me to?
A house.
Okay.
And she wants the author of that. I did this too. Sharon's.
Smaller than mine, and mine
Probably haven't
is
read it yet, it just came
No,
out.
but I.
per floor, 2 floors.
Size of our house, 16.
Yeah, 1600. So here was this little house that was.
Oh, I go up.
So do you think it's worth reading?
I'm gonna come back and so I'm gonna hopefully be at Kennedy Yard.
Oh,
You
yes.
can never read.
So 1.9 years.
Tell them it's their anniversary again. If it's a different person.
No,